East 46th Street, Manhattan, December 16, 1985, 5:46 p.m. It was Monday evening rush hour in Midtown Manhattan. Thousands of people on the streets. Commuters heading to Grand Central Station. Christmas shoppers. Tourists. Traffic was gridlocked on East 46th Street between 2nd and 3rd Avenues. Sparks Steakhouse, one of Manhattan's finest restaurants, was preparing for dinner service. And at 5:46 p.m., a black Lincoln Town car pulled up in front of the restaurant. The back door opened. Paul Castellano, 70 years old, boss of the Gambino crime family, wearing a $2,000 suit and a cashmere overcoat, stepped out onto the sidewalk. Behind him, his driver and bodyguard Thomas Bellotti got out of the car. They started walking toward the restaurant entrance, and 4 men wearing white trench coats and Russian fur hats approached them rapidly. The 4 men pulled out semi-automatic pistols and opened fire. In the middle of Manhattan, at rush hour, with hundreds of witnesses, 6 bullets hit Paul Castellano, in the head, in the chest. He collapsed on the sidewalk. Thomas Bellotti was shot multiple times. He fell next to his boss, both dead within seconds. The 4 shooters calmly walked away, got into waiting cars, and disappeared into Manhattan traffic. Across the street, John Gotti watched from his car. He'd just killed his boss, in the most public hit in modern mob history. And he'd gotten away with it. Because this was December the 16th, 1985. The night John Gotti became the Dapper Don. The night the Gambino family changed forever. The night Paul Castellano died on a Manhattan sidewalk in a $2,000 suit. But to understand how the boss of America's most powerful crime family ended up murdered in rush hour Manhattan, we need to go back 50 years, to 1934, when a young Italian-American kid in Brooklyn discovered that crime was more profitable than honest work. Paul Castellano, the butcher's son from Brooklyn. Constantino. Paul Castellano was born June 26, 1915, in Brooklyn, New York, to Italian immigrant parents from Sicily. His father was a butcher who owned a small shop. The family was working class, but not desperately poor. Paul grew up in a tight-knit Italian neighborhood where everyone knew each other and many families had connections to organized crime. Paul's life changed when his sister Catherine married Carlo Gambino in 1926. Carlo Gambino was a young, ambitious mobster in the Mangano crime family, one of New York's 5 mafia families. Through this family connection, Paul was introduced to the mob world at a young age. By his late teens, Paul was doing small jobs for the mob: collections, messages, minor enforcement. He was smart, reliable, and most importantly, he was Carlo Gambino's brother-in-law. In the 1940s, Paul Castellano became a made man in the Mangano family, which would later become the Gambino family. But Paul wasn't a typical gangster. He didn't like violence. He wasn't a tough street fighter. He preferred business, making money through rackets, construction, unions. Paul discovered he had a talent for white-collar crime and business operations. While other mobsters were hijacking trucks and robbing, Paul was running legitimate-looking businesses that laundered mob money. The Gambino family, Carlo's empire. In 1957, Carlo Gambino became boss of what was then called the Anastasia family, after Albert Anastasia was murdered in a barber shop. Carlo renamed it the Gambino family and built it into the most powerful crime family in America. Carlo was smart, cautious, and diplomatic. He avoided publicity. He ran the family like a business, and he groomed Paul Castellano, his brother-in-law, for leadership. By the 1960s and 1970s, Paul Castellano had become one of Carlo's most trusted capos. Paul ran construction rackets, controlled concrete unions, and had his hand in various legitimate businesses. Paul was making millions through white-collar schemes that rarely involved direct violence. When Carlo Gambino died of a heart attack on October 15, 1976, He left specific instructions. Paul Castellano should become boss. This surprised many in the Gambino family. There were other, more traditional mobsters who expected to become boss. But Carlo wanted Paul because Paul represented the future, making money through business rather than through old-school street crime. On December 2, 1976, Paul Castellano became boss of the Gambino crime family. He was 61 years old, and he would rule for the next 9 years until John Gotti killed him. The White House, Paul's mansion. When Paul became boss, he was already wealthy. He'd made millions through construction rackets and various businesses, and he lived like it. In the 1970s, Paul built a mansion in the Tot Hill neighborhood of Staten Island, one of the wealthiest areas in New York City. The house was enormous, 17 rooms, 6,000 square feet, sitting on over an acre of land, swimming pool, tennis court, manicured, gardens, fountains, security gates. The mansion was so grand and so white that other mobsters sarcastically called it the White House. Paul loved it. He decorated it expensively. He hosted dinners for captains and associates. He had servants. He lived like a millionaire CEO, not like a mob boss. And this created resentment. Many Gambino soldiers and captains thought Paul was out of touch. He didn't understand street crime anymore. He didn't hang out in social clubs like traditional bosses. He rarely met with lower-level guys. He ran the family from his mansion like a corporate headquarters. Old-school mobsters hated this. They felt disrespected. And none felt this more strongly than John Gotti. John Gotti, the blue-collar gangster. John Gotti was born October 27, 1940, in the Bronx, to a poor Italian-American family. His father was a construction laborer who struggled to support the family. They moved to Brooklyn when John was young, living in poverty and tough neighborhoods. John grew up tough. He joined street gangs. He dropped out of school. By his teens, he was stealing, hijacking trucks, running with older criminals. In the 1960s and 1970s, John Gotti became a made man in the Gambino family. He specialized in hijackings, stealing trucks full of cargo and selling the goods. He was good at it. Tough, charismatic, loyal, but he was also reckless and violent. Gotti operated out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, Queens, a working-class social club where blue-collar gangsters hung out. This was Gotti's world. Street crime, gambling, hijackings. Not Paul Castellano's world of white-collar rackets and construction contracts. By the early 1980s, Gotti had become a captain in the Gambino family. He was popular with soldiers because he was generous. He shared profits, paid well, and took care of his crew. But Gotti hated Paul Castellano with an intensity that went beyond simple dislike. To Gotti, Paul represented everything wrong with the modern mob and everything that disrespected the working-class gangsters who actually took the risks. The resentment was deep and multifaceted. The wealth gap. Paul lived in a $3.5 million mansion with servants, tennis courts, and swimming pools. Gotti lived in a modest house in Queens. Paul wore $2,000 custom-tailored suits from exclusive Manhattan tailors. Gotti wore nice suits, too. He was always well-dressed, but his suits cost $500, maybe $800, not $2,000. Paul drove in chauffeur-driven limousines. Gotti drove himself or was driven by crew members. The wealth gap wasn't just about money. It was about respect. Gotti felt Paul was flaunting his wealth and looking down on soldiers who'd never lived like that. The distance. Paul rarely met with captains and soldiers anymore. He ran the family from his mansion, communicating through intermediaries. If you wanted to meet with Paul, you had to be invited to the White House on Staten Island, a trek from Queens or Brooklyn that felt like going to see royalty. Traditional mob bosses held court in social clubs where soldiers could come and go, where the boss was accessible. Paul had isolated himself behind gates and security. To working-class mobsters like Gotti, This felt like disrespect and cowardice. A boss should be among his men, not living like a king in a castle. The white-collar focus. Paul was making hundreds of millions from construction, concrete, unions, white-collar rackets that required no violence and minimal risk. Meanwhile, Gotti and his crew were doing hijackings, running gambling operations, dealing with street-level enforcement, the dangerous hands-on crimes that actually risked prison. Paul was benefiting from the family's reputation and power, built on violence by men like Gotti, while keeping his own hands clean and getting rich. Gotti felt this was hypocritical. The drug rule, hypocrisy. Paul's no heroin rule particularly enraged Gotti. Paul claimed drugs brought too much law, enforcement attention, and that anyone caught dealing would be killed. But Gotti knew the real reason. Paul didn't want competition for the family's traditional rackets, and he looked down on drug dealing as beneath him. Meanwhile, some of Gotti's crew members, guys who'd been loyal soldiers for years, were making fortunes from heroin. These were guys who'd never get rich from Paul's construction rackets. Heroin was their way to earn. When several of Gotti's associates were arrested on drug charges in 1984, Paul demanded they be killed according to his rule. Gotti refused. He protected his guys, and this created an irreparable breach. Paul saw Gotti as insubordinate. Gotti saw Paul as out of touch and willing to kill loyal soldiers to enforce an arbitrary rule. The mistress scandal, Paul's affair with his Colombian maid Gloria Olarte, infuriated Gotti on multiple levels. First, Paul was married to Nina Gambino, Carlo Gambino's sister. Disrespecting her was disrespecting the Gambino legacy. Second, Paul wasn't being discreet. He was openly living with Gloria in the mansion, essentially abandoning his wife. In traditional mob culture, bosses could have affairs. Everyone did. But you kept it quiet. You maintained the appearance of a proper family. Paul's openness about Gloria showed he didn't care what anyone thought. Third, and perhaps most galling to Gotti, while Paul was living in luxury with his young mistress, his actual wife, Carlo's sister, was being humiliated. This disrespected the memory of Carlo Gambino, who Gotti had greatly respected. By late 1995, Gotti's resentment had crystallized into certainty. Paul Castellano had to go. This wasn't just about power. It was about respect, tradition, and what the mob should be. Gotti believed he'd be a better boss because he understood the soldiers, respected tradition, and wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. The problems, 1983 on 1985. By the early 1980s, Paul Castellano had several major problems that would ultimately get him killed. Problem 1. The commission case. In 1985, federal prosecutors indicted Paul Castellano and other commission members, bosses of New York's 5 families, on racketeering charges. The commission case threatened to send Paul to prison for life. This made Paul vulnerable and distracted. Problem 2. The heroin rule. Paul Castellano, like Carlo Gambino before him, had a strict rule: no drug trafficking. Anyone caught dealing heroin would be killed. Paul believed drugs brought too much law enforcement attention, but many Gambino members, including people in John Gotti's crew, were making millions from heroin. They ignored the rule and dealt drugs anyway. In 1984, several Gambino members connected to Gotti's crew were arrested on heroin charges. Paul was furious. He demanded they be killed according to his rule. Gotti protected his guys. He refused to kill them. This created a direct conflict between Paul and Gotti. Problem 3. The FBI bugs. The FBI had installed listening devices, bugs, in Paul's mansion, the White House, and in the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club where Gotti operated. These bugs captured conversations that would later be used in trials. But in 1985, the Gambino family didn't yet know the full extent of the surveillance. They just knew The FBI was aggressively targeting them. Problem 4. Paul's maid and mistress. Paul Castellano was married to his wife Nina, Carlo Gambino's sister, but by the 1980s, he was having an affair with his Colombian maid, Gloria Olarte. Paul was openly living with Gloria in the White House while his wife lived elsewhere. This was scandalous in the traditional mob culture. Bosses were supposed to be discreet about affairs. Paul, flaunting his mistress, was seen as disrespectful to his wife's family, the Gambinos, and to mob tradition. These problems created the conditions for John Gotti's coup. The conspiracy. Gotti plans the hit. By late 1985, John Gotti decided that Paul Castellano had to go. Gotti believed if he killed Paul and took over the Gambino family, soldiers would support him because Paul was unpopular. But Gotti had a problem. You can't kill a boss without commission approval. The commission, the ruling body of New York's 5 families, had strict rules. Killing a boss without authorization meant death. Gotti decided to take the risk. He believed that if he killed Paul successfully and quickly consolidated power, the commission would accept the fait accompli rather than starting a war. Gotti recruited several key conspirators. Sammy the Bull Gravano, a powerful Gambino captain who shared Gotti's hatred of Paul. Sammy agreed to help plan and execute the hit. Angelo Ruggiero, Gotti's childhood friend and close associate. Frank DeZico, another Gambino captain who wanted Paul gone. Together, they planned the assassination. They decided to kill Paul in public, in Manhattan, to send a message. The new boss, Gotti, wasn't afraid of anything. December 16, 1985, the Fui Sorfoi setup. Paul Castellano had a reservation at Sparks Steakhouse for Monday, December 16, 1985, at 6 p.m. Sparks was a high-end Manhattan steakhouse at 210 East 46th Street, between 2nd and 3rd Avenues. Paul loved Sparks. He ate there regularly. It was the kind of upscale restaurant that fit his lifestyle. Gotti's crew learned about the reservation, possibly through someone close to Paul or through surveillance. They decided this was the perfect opportunity. The plan: 4 shooters would wait near Sparks wearing disguises. When Paul arrived, they'd kill him on the sidewalk before he entered the restaurant. Gotti and Sammy Gravano would watch from a car parked nearby to ensure the hit went smoothly. The shooters were chosen from Gotti's crew, soldiers willing to kill a boss. On the afternoon of December 16, 1985, the conspirators took their positions. December 16, 1985, 5:30 to 5:45 p.m., the approach. At approximately 5:30 p.m., 4 shooters arrived near Sparks Steakhouse. They wore white trench coats and Russian-style fur hats, deliberately conspicuous clothing that would hide their faces while also making them memorable enough that witness descriptions would vary. The white coats were practical too, easy to remove and discard after the shooting. The 4 shooters were likely Eddie Lino, Salvatore Scala, John Carneglia, and Anthony Center, all Gambino soldiers loyal to Gotti. They positioned themselves on East 46th Street near the restaurant entrance. They tried to blend in with the rush hour crowds, but 4 men in white coats standing near an entrance looked slightly out of place. At 5:40 p.m., John Gotti and Sammy Gravano parked in a car on 3rd Avenue, approximately 100 yards from Sparks, with a clear view of the restaurant entrance. Gotti lit a cigar. Sammy sat quietly. They waited. At 5:45 p.m., Paul Castellano's black Lincoln Town car, driven by his bodyguard and newly promoted underboss Thomas Bellotti, left Staten Island and headed toward Manhattan. Paul sat in the back, wearing an expensive suit and cashmere overcoat. He was relaxed. He had no idea this was the last 15 minutes of his life. December 16, 1985, 5:46 p.m., the hit. At precisely 5:46 p.m., Paul's Lincoln pulled up in front of Sparks Steakhouse. Thomas Bellotti parked the car directly in front of the entrance, in a no-parking zone. He got out of the driver's side. Paul opened the back door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. East 46th Street was crowded. Rush hour commuters, Christmas shoppers, people walking to restaurants, hundreds of potential witnesses. The four shooters, standing about 20 feet from the car, saw Paul emerge. They moved quickly and deliberately toward him. Paul saw them approaching but didn't immediately recognize danger. They were just four men in white coats, maybe other diners. At precisely 5:46 p.m., as verified later by multiple witness watches and building security cameras, Paul's black Lincoln Town car pulled up in front of Sparks Steakhouse at 210 East 46th Street. Thomas Bellotti, 46 years old, newly promoted to underboss by Paul, fiercely loyal, was driving. He pulled directly in front of the restaurant entrance in a no parking zone, planning to drop Paul off and then park the car properly. Bellotti turned off the engine and opened the driver's side door. He was wearing a leather jacket and casual clothes, not as formal as Paul. Paul, in the back seat, gathered his cashmere overcoat around him and opened the rear passenger side door. He stepped out onto the Manhattan sidewalk. East 46th Street at 5:46 p.m. on a December Monday was crowded. Office workers walking toward Grand Central Station to catch trains to the suburbs. Christmas shoppers carrying bags from Manhattan stores. Tourists looking at restaurant menus. Couples walking arm in arm. The sidewalk was full of people moving in both directions. Paul stood approximately 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed around 250 pounds. A large, imposing figure made even more impressive by his expensive clothes and confident bearing. He closed the car door behind him and turned toward the restaurant entrance. The four shooters, positioned approximately 20 to 25 feet from where the Lincoln parked, saw Paul emerge. They'd been waiting for nearly 15 minutes. Now they moved with practiced precision. The four men, all wearing nearly identical white trench coats that went down to their knees and Russian-style fur hats pulled low over their faces, began walking rapidly toward Paul. Not running, just walking with purpose. Their hands were inside their coats. From 100 yards away, John Gotti saw the movement begin. He leaned forward in his car slightly, watching. Sammy Gravano sat rigid beside him, also watching. Neither spoke. Paul Castellano saw the four men approaching. For perhaps 2 seconds, his brain processed the visual. Four men in identical white coats, walking directly toward him, hands concealed. This was wrong. Danger. His body tensed. He started to step backward, toward the car. Too late. The lead shooter, likely Eddie Lino or Salvatore Scala based on later FBI investigations, pulled a semi-automatic pistol from inside his coat. A .380 or 9mm pistol, small enough to conceal easily, but deadly at close range. He raised it toward Paul's head and fired from approximately 8 feet away. The sharp crack of the gunshot cut through the street noise. The first bullet struck Paul Castellano in the right side of his head, just above and behind his ear. The bullet, traveling at roughly 100 feet per second, penetrated his skull and entered his brain. The impact jerked Paul's head violently to the left. Blood erupted from the entry wound. Paul staggered but didn't fall immediately. His body, running on neural reflexes even as his brain was dying, tried to keep him upright. The other three shooters now had their guns out. They formed a rough semicircle around Paul, cutting off any escape. And they opened fire systematically. The second bullet hit Paul in the chest, penetrating his expensive suit jacket, his shirt, and entering his torso below the ribcage. The third bullet struck him in the left shoulder, shattering his clavicle. The fourth, fifth, and sixth bullets hit him in rapid succession. Torso, chest, and one more to the head. 6 bullets total in approximately 5 seconds. Paul Castellano's body couldn't withstand this assault. His legs gave out. He fell forward, his large frame hitting the sidewalk hard. His cashmere overcoat spread around him. Blood pooled beneath his head and torso, the expensive fabric soaking it up. Thomas Bellotti, seeing the attack, reached for his weapon. But he was too slow. The shooters turned their guns on him. Bellotti was shot multiple times. At least 6 bullets hit him. He fell beside the Lincoln, dying almost instantly. The entire shooting lasted approximately 15 to 20 seconds. When the shooters were confident, both targets were dead. They calmly walked away from the scene. They didn't run. Just walked quickly down East 46th Street toward 2nd Avenue. Waiting cars picked them up. They drove away into Manhattan traffic, removed their white coats, and disappeared. Paul Castellano lay dead on the sidewalk. Thomas Bellotti lay dead beside the car. And John Gotti, watching from 100 yards away, smiled. The aftermath. Chaos on East 46th Street. For a moment after the shooting, there was shocked silence. Then screaming started. Witnesses ran. People dove into stores. Someone called 911. NYPD units arrived within minutes. Ambulances came quickly. But it was obvious both men were dead. The crime scene was photographed extensively. Paul Castellano's body lay on the sidewalk, blood pooling around his head. His expensive clothes were now evidence. The scene was surreal. One of America's most powerful mobsters, dead on a Manhattan sidewalk during rush hour. Dozens of witnesses were interviewed by police. But as always, in mob hits, nobody had seen anything useful. The shooters wore hats and coats. It all happened so fast. People couldn't describe faces. Within hours, the media descended. News helicopters circled. TV crews broadcast live from East 46th Street. This wasn't a mob hit in Brooklyn or Queens. This was Manhattan. Midtown. One of the busiest areas in the world. The audacity was shocking. The investigation, Gotti becomes suspect. NYPD and FBI immediately suspected John Gotti. They knew about the tensions between Gotti and Paul. They knew Gotti had motive. But suspecting and proving are different things. Gotti had an alibi. He was having dinner with associates at the time. Witnesses couldn't identify the shooters. The white coats and hats were never found. No murder weapon was recovered. The FBI intensified surveillance on Gotti. They knew he'd done it, but they couldn't prove it. Yet. John Gotti, the new boss. Within 2 weeks of Paul's murder, John Gotti was declared the new boss of the Gambino family. He didn't ask commission permission. He didn't hold a formal election. He just took power. And he did it in a way that was unprecedented in modern mob history. Publicly, confidently, without apology. On December 30th, 1985, just 14 days after the Castellano hit, Gotti held a meeting at the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy. He informed the Gambino captains that he was now boss, Sammy Gravano was underboss, and Frank DeCicco was consigliere. The captains accepted it. Some because they'd been part of the conspiracy, others because they'd hated Paul anyway, and some because they understood that challenging Gotti now would mean death. The other 4 New York families, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno, faced a difficult decision. The commission rules stated that killing a boss without authorization merited death. By that rule, Gotti should be killed. But starting a war with the Gambino family, the largest and most powerful of the 5 families, would be costly, bloody, and might fail. The other bosses calculated Paul Castellano was dead. Nothing would bring him back. Gotti had acted decisively and now controlled the Gambino family. Accept the new reality or risk a war that might destroy multiple families. They chose acceptance, with conditions. The Genovese family, led by Vincent Chin Gigante, sent messages to Gotti. The hit was done, it's over, but there will be consequences. Those consequences came 4 months later when Frank DeCicco was killed by a car bomb. But Gotti himself was accepted as the legitimate boss. The Dapper Don, Gotti's public persona. John Gotti became the most famous mob boss in America, possibly in history, because of how he embraced publicity. Previous bosses had hidden from cameras, avoided publicity, maintained low profiles. Carlo Gambino had died almost unknown to the general public. Paul Castellano rarely appeared in public, and certainly never courted media. Gotti did the opposite. He held court publicly at the Ravenite Social Club at 247 Mulberry Street in Little Italy. He walked the streets. He talked to reporters. When arrested or appearing at trials, he wore $2,000 suits. Ironically, now he could afford them. Perfectly styled hair and expensive shoes. The media loved him. He was handsome, charismatic, quotable. Tabloids called him the Dapper Don because of his clothes. When he beat 3 prosecutions in the late 1980s, acquitted in 1986, 1987, and 1990, the media dubbed him the Teflon Don because charges wouldn't stick. After his 1990 acquittal, Gotti held a 4th of July party in Ozone Park, Queens, that drew thousands of people and was covered extensively by news media. He was treated like a celebrity. This publicity made Gotti wildly popular in some Italian-American neighborhoods in New York. People saw him as a Robin Hood figure, a working-class kid from Queens who'd made it big and wasn't afraid of anyone. But the publicity also made Gotti a massive target for law enforcement. The FBI's obsession. The FBI became obsessed with convicting John Gotti. The Bureau dedicated enormous resources, dozens of agents, millions of dollars, years of investigation, to building a case against him. They wiretapped the Ravenite Social Club. They followed Gotti constantly. They pressured his associates to flip. The FBI's problem was that Gotti was smart about some things. He didn't discuss business in obvious locations. He used intermediaries. He was careful about who he trusted. But Gotti made mistakes. He talked too much. And the FBI eventually planted bugs in the Ravenite that captured Gotti's voice discussing murders, including the Castellano hit. The betrayal. Sammy Gravano. By the early 1990s, the FBI had built a case against Gotti using bugs in the Ravenite Social Club. They recorded Gotti talking about murders and crimes. In 1990, Gotti was arrested on murder and racketeering charges. His trial began in 1992. And then, Sammy the Bull Gravano, Gotti's underboss, and the man who'd helped plan Paul Castellano's murder, made a stunning decision. He agreed to cooperate with the government. Sammy testified against Gotti, admitting to 19 murders and providing detailed testimony about the Castellano hit and other crimes. With Sammy's testimony, Gotti was convicted on April 2, 1992. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. John Gotti died in prison on June 10, 2002, at age 61. The conspiracy revealed. Frank DeCicco. Frank DeCicco, one of the conspirators in the Castellano hit, became underboss under Gotti. But the other families hadn't forgotten the unauthorized hit. On April 13, 1986, less than 4 months after Paul's murder, a bomb exploded under Frank DeCicco's car as he left a social club in Brooklyn. The bomb killed DeCicco instantly. It was retaliation from the Lucchese or Genovese families, sending a message: killing a boss has consequences. The Sparks Steakhouse, still there. Sparks Steakhouse still operates today at 210 East 46th Street in Manhattan. It's a landmark, a tourist attraction. People come specifically to see where Paul Castellano was killed. The restaurant doesn't hide from its history. They acknowledge it. And they still serve excellent steaks. The sidewalk where Paul died has been walked on by millions since 1985. There's no plaque, no memorial. Just the knowledge that this spot, this ordinary Manhattan sidewalk, was the scene of one of the most public mob hits in history. The legacy, the last public hit. The Castellano murder was the last major public mob hit in New York. After 1985, mob killings became quieter, more discreet. Bodies disappeared. Hits happened in private. The Castellano hit was too brazen, too public, and it brought too much law enforcement attention. The FBI used the Castellano murder as leverage to flip witnesses, build cases, and ultimately dismantle much of the Gambino family's power. By the 2000s, the Gambino family was a shadow of what it had been under Paul or Gotti. Paul Castellano, the CEO who died like a gangster. Paul Castellano tried to be a different kind of mob boss. He wanted to be a CEO, not a street thug. He wore expensive suits. He lived in a mansion. He ran the family like a corporation. He avoided violence when possible. But in the end, the mob is still the mob. And Paul died the way mobsters die, shot on the street by men who wanted his power. December 16th, 1985, 5:46 p.m. Rush hour Manhattan, 6 bullets, a $2,000 suit soaked in blood. Paul Castellano's attempt to be a gentleman gangster ended on a sidewalk in front of a steakhouse. Conclusion: the night Gotti took over, December 16th, 1985. 5:46 p.m., Sparks Steakhouse. Paul Castellano stepped out of his Lincoln. 4 men in white trench coats approached. 6 bullets, dead on the sidewalk. John Gotti watched from across the street, and the Gambino family changed forever. Paul Castellano, who tried to run the mob like a business, learned that business rules don't apply in the mafia. Power comes from violence. And if your own men think you're weak or out of touch, they'll kill you. Doesn't matter how expensive your suit is. Doesn't matter how big your mansion is. In the mob, power belongs to whoever's willing to take it. John Gotti took it on a Manhattan sidewalk in rush hour, and for a few years, he was the king of New York, until Sammy Gravano betrayed him, and he died in a prison cell. The cycle continues. Boss kills boss. Underboss betrays boss. Everyone ends up dead or in prison. December 16th, 1985 was just another turn of that cycle. Paul Castellano in a $2,000 suit, dead at 70, on a Manhattan sidewalk, 6 bullets, rush hour, hundreds of witnesses, and nobody saw anything. If you found this story compelling, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from organized crime history. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Thank you for watching.